Welcome to our first session of Conversations On, and this session of Conversations On centres on the Book of Lamentations. And in this year of COVID-19, there appears to be a lot for us to lament, whether that be loss of life, loss of earnings, or simply our loss of our time this year that we seem to have been in stasis while everything around us carries on and the pandemic raged around us. And so it seemed particularly pertinent for us to discuss the Book of Lamentations, which is a book of unadulterated grief. It is unrestrained grief that questions the very existence of God. And it is one of the lesser known books of the Bible. And for us, as we read it, we can see that grief and trauma are the main themes of the book. And as we reflect, as we read Lamentations, and as we reflect on our time in this pandemic, it brings us questions of how we should mourn, how we express our grief, what should we do as Christians in this pandemic, and how do we feel God's presence in this pandemic? What does it mean to lose our in-person church, and how do we draw parallels between that and the loss of the temple in Jerusalem? And how do we maintain a relationship of God in absence of community? And so we hope that you will continue to join us for this short session of discussion, and then join us as well on Good Friday to enter into deeper discussion into the themes of Lamentations. Hello, my name's Reverend Rosemary Hill, and I'm Vicar of Pontyclun, Talagarn and Llanharry within the benefice of Llantrisant.
Hi, I'm Vincent Gardner, who's the rector of the ministry area of Llantrisant. Have an interest in philosophy and the arts.
Hello, I'm Professor Lloyd Llewelyn Jones. I'm the chair of ancient history at Cardiff University, and I'm coming to this as both a Christian and as a scholar of the Bible and the ancient Near East. And perhaps now that you've had our introduction from Rosemary, and also maybe you've done the reading or listened to the recordings of Lamentations, we just thought we'd riff a little bit on the idea of what the book speaks to us about, and where we can go with it in this time of pandemic and international grief, I suppose. For me, if I may start, I guess when I came to Lamentations first, it's in its ancient context, obviously, is how I know it best. So, you know, the 6th century was a time of terrible turmoil for the Jews. It's a time of, as you say, unmitigated grief, but also of unlimited trauma as well. It's the moment where they see their whole identity being ripped from them. As the Babylonians came into Jerusalem and they laid siege to the city for 2 years. You know, it's almost impossible for us to get our heads around this idea of a siege warfare. Imagine being, you know, well, perhaps not actually in a lockdown. You know, you're locked in one place, but the misery goes on because, of course, people are dying, people are starving, there are corpses in the street, disease is rampant. It's a horrific situation. And then finally the Babylonians break through the city, they find the city in chaos, and they raze it to the ground. And in particular, of course, they destroy the temple of God, the temple of Yahweh himself. Many of the population of Jerusalem, especially the elites, okay, the priests, the kings, the counselors, the artists, the poets, they're all taken off to captivity, and what's left behind are the dregs, quite literally the dregs of society, remnants is the word that the prophets often use of this. And the Jews never forgot this trauma. And what we have in Lamentations is this kind of under the microscope vision of the suffering of the people at this moment when their identity has been shattered and what seems to be a complete absence of their God. Their whole world has become topsy-turvy, so that God of Israel, that God of the covenant, who's protected them all this time, is suddenly not there. And what I get from this, of course, is first of all, this kind of lamentation is typical of ancient Near Eastern texts. We've got lots of them, actually, from Mesopotamia, from Egypt. You know, it's what people did. It's a genre of literature. But in all of the other texts, towards the end, the gods come back, the gods restore something. But you can flick through right to the end of Lamentations, but God don't come back here. I mean, there is no resolution. God is absent throughout. That's hard to take, isn't it? An absent God. What do we think about Lamentations' absent God?
For me, it's one of the more positive aspects of this book. I mean, I think we'll come to the last dirge, chapter 5, a bit later. I still have a question mark over those final verses because they offer too much hope for me. I quite like, in any time of pandemic or great catastrophe, surely there has to be a question mark over the God that you have travelled with so far. I mean, I know there's an issue surrounding the authorship, not necessarily Jeremiah, but Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, on the, I think it's the left-hand side of the high altar, you have this wonderful portrait of Jeremiah. And he's very solid. This is obviously a man of action, man of physicality, who has his head in his hands, and it's complete and utter despair that Michelangelo portrays. I mean,
this is why he's called the Weeping Prophet, of course, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's also a self-portrait of Michelangelo, but we won't go into that. But what you see there is someone contemplating that the God that he has travelled with will not be the same God that he continues with, is my position. That when you go into a pandemic, the question mark has to be, will you come out of that pandemic with the same God? Because arguably, when they returned from exile, it wasn't the same God that they returned with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Rose, what's your thought on that?
I find sort of the idea of the lament and the absence of God interesting, and I think I agree with Vincent that the perception of God is different coming back after the exile than who they are going in, and I think I'm particularly interested with who God was for those who were left behind, as you know,
at the time during this trauma. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
This guttural crying out to a God that isn't answering them, and yet we know that for those who were off in Babylon, God still seems present to them, even though they were away from the temple. Yet here, God is absent. God isn't there, and the for want of a better phrase, the personality of the God that they're crying out to, he's not he or she or it isn't answering back, and I'm fascinated by the rhetoric that goes on and the dialogue and the one-sided dialogue that goes on between the speaker in Lamentations, whoever the speaker is in each chapter, because sometimes it can seem like as if it's different which speaker.
Yes, absolutely. It does seem to shift, doesn't it?
Does, because the speaker in chapter 3 can seem quite different to the speaker in chapter 1, and by the time we get to chapter 3 there's a different tone, although we know they weren't ordered chronologically. There's a different sense of tone to the way
it's almost like a kind of Dylan Thomas radio play, isn't it? It's a play for voices in a way, where you get different members of that community, and I think community is the center point of this, the community of the left behind, the forgotten ones, articulating what they feel. For me, it's chapter 3, the longest of the chapters, which is often thought to be also, the central tenet of the whole thing, where we have this so-called strong man who speaks, strong man who's actually very, very weak indeed. He's trembling at the knees almost. And for me, that idea of the old God gone is there when he draws up the image. I think in verse 44 of the cloud, he says, you've covered yourself with a cloud. So, like, in other words, he's put a block between himself, God himself, and his people. And isn't that just an incredible corruption of how God appeared to them before? When he led them out of Egypt during the great Exodus, of course, he took the form of a cloud, as it were, carefully led them through the wilderness. This cloud was a symbol of their protection, their all-covering, enveloping thing. But now he's using it as blocking the signal. You can no longer access God. And yes, for me, that suggests that all of the norms of past worship, or past identity with Yahweh, are completely up for grabs. Everything is being changed by this. And this poor man, this strong man, just wants to get back to that covenant relationship all the time. Please remember what we were. Please remember what we were. And that, I suppose, is the question that we can be asking of ourselves in the next months, as we come up now to the anniversary of a whole year of living with this disease. You know, will you be with us again, God? And where have you been? You know, have we all felt God's presence throughout this? Well, I'm sure we can say that not all the time. It's been difficult, even for, I'm sure, the most ardent Christians. What are your thoughts on some of that?
Rose, do you want to go first?
I think I have to. I think the parallels between this templeless age and the arguments that we've seen raging on social media, especially Anglican social media, on Anglican Twitter and things, about whether church is still church if it's online. You know, can you email an apple and things like that, are very very pertinent to this discussion, because we've got this. You know, can they still have a relationship with God without the temple? Can they still have a relationship with God when their world has been turned upside down? And here we have something similar, as we've been stuck indoors. We haven't been able to go and receive the sacrament in the same way as we have been in the past. But does that mean that our relationship with God has changed? And so, yes, I agree with you. I think it throws up so many questions, and there's so many, and also that sense of marginalisation. So when they return from the exile, of course, the returners are very quick to tell those who are left behind, you know, this isn't good enough. What you've been doing for the last few years, it isn't good enough. We're superior because we were the creme de la creme that the Babylonians took away. And we see that as also in the debates that rage about the sacraments and online church, where we have those who are marginalised, those who relied on online church almost since the beginning of the internet because they are housebound or for whatever reason are unable to access church. Maybe they don't feel safe coming to church, and suddenly they're being told, well, this isn't good enough. What you've done for the last 10, 15 years that you have found has fed you and sustained you in your own faith isn't good enough, because we as the mainstream have said, well, you know, that we are that our way is the best way, but suddenly we're all having to find that way, and there's almost a sense of appropriating what other people have been doing for many, many years.
Vincent, what's your take on this idea of a templeless community, really, a churchless church community?
Yes, the issue I have at the moment, it is rushing forward too quickly. It's offering hope in a time of despair, which is the knee-jerk reaction for the church, and I'm not sure that is what is required now. In chapter 3, to me, this is where it's most problematic for our age, because you find there that the author is resorting to old tactics. It's a laying out of all their sins, and maybe this is why God is now absent. Well, we cannot do that in this pandemic. To say, well, we are in this situation because of sin, I think is something which wouldn't resonate with the vast majority. I mean, one thought I've had is you've seen quite quickly the big hitters have responded by publishing their books. Professor Tom Wright has published a book on the pandemic, and Rowan also has rejigged some reflections, and even Pope Francis. And in spite of their different theologies and stances, in the background of all three works is something which I find, again, highly problematic, which is this belief in the sovereignty of God. That it's okay, in a sense, yes, we have to suffer, yes, we have to stand alongside the suffering, but there is this hope, there is this push me, pull me sort of theology, which is just ahead. Now, on Good Friday, there was no hope. If you say to the disciples, well, the crucifixion is okay because in 2 days is a resurrection, then it alters the dynamic. We have to live Good Friday and Holy Saturday without hope, otherwise it doesn't have balance. So all through this book, my issue is how this resonates with us now, it's still quite, even though there's doubts, there's still a positive relationship with this absent God, which I don't feel is what is called for now.
Some of it is to do with blame, isn't it? There's quite a lot of blame game going on throughout Lamentations with these different voices. So, for instance, as you say, the strong man of chapter 3 blames the community. You know, we have done things wrong. We have not followed your laws. We have not followed your. We have not been accountable for ourselves, and that's typical kind of traumatic reflection, isn't it? You know, very often suffering a trauma, we pull it back on ourselves. If only I had done this, if only we had. And that's kind of typical. But then there are other kind of blames that go on as well. So in chapter 1, which has a very different tone, Zion, Jerusalem, is represented as a woman, and everybody is blaming her. You went astray, you went with foreign men, so therefore made foreign alliances and so forth. And there's a kind of very much a bullying culture that goes on in this. And especially, the horrific images which are used in chapter 1 of sex and rape in particular, that idea of rape and blame, that culture that corrupts our society so much these days is inherent there. And as we go through the book, constantly blame. Somebody is being blamed apart from God. Can we blame God? Should we be blaming God for things? As you say, Vincent, it's hard for us now to say that in this day and age, this plague that we're now suffering must be a punishment from God. But isn't God responsible? Should we be blaming him? Can we blame God? Generally, are we allowed as Christians to blame God?
I mean,
did you take the shame?
I mean, I don't know, Rose, if you want to jump in, but I would say this is at the crux of the matter. I think very often the church wants to rush on too quickly, and we need to allow space to blame God. It's only in that blaming that we travelled a journey to arrive at the point where we don't need that God anymore, that we actually desire and long for. It's a renegotiation of the relationship, of the dynamic. And so we exit eventually with a new God. But if we don't acknowledge, and I keep coming back to the arts, but Anselm Kiefer, a contemporary German artist, he portrays these vast landscapes, and they're completely and utterly without hope. And he was offering that to the German people, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as they dealt with the guilt of the Second World War. His point was, it wasn't the time to offer the glimmer of hope. The whole point of lament and is for me, is to realise the extent of the despair. And maybe that's enough for us as a church now, is to just hold the despair and not rush in with our answers.
I think I would agree with you, Vincent. I mean, I saw a tweet from a Church of England communications page a few days ago. Oh, yes, actually it was yesterday. I'm losing track with the lockdown. There's another thing is to think about. It's the loss of time, isn't it, with the lockdown? But and it was yesterday, and it was something along the lines of they tweeted. I didn't watch the video. I couldn't bring myself to actually watch the video. But the video was basically the title of it is we've had our best year. We've gone online. We've done so many 100 online services. This has been wonderful. This has been amazing. And seeing the responses of people to that tweet but what about the 150,000 people who have died? What about, will the people who've had to watch their grandmother being buried via a Facebook Live link feel as happy about your online services as you do? And there was this rush to resurrection, this rush to the good, isn't allowing for a moment to actually go, to be honest, this is crap. This is awful. This is people have died. And I worry that this lack of lament, this rush to, yes, we've got this day of reflection next week, but this rush to not actually consider and allow people to grieve, this rush to get everything back to normal, is ultimately going to be damaging, because I think actually in faith, it's those moments, it's those Good Friday moments, it's those Black Saturday moments where we question our faith, where faith grows. Because if we don't question our faith, if we don't question why things happened, how we believe those things, then faith can stagnate. And so I think I agree with Vincent to a certain extent that we need to sit with Good Friday. We need to sit with the Saturday and the harrowing of hell and all that's going on, in order to actually have a real tangible sense of resurrection, rather than this rush to sort of say how wonderful everything is. Because yes, everything is wonderful in terms of the efforts that have gone in, but our people sitting in the pews would no way say that their online church is as good as sitting in mass and then having a cup of coffee and a chat and being able to hold their friend because their friend has just buried their husband after the service. That's not the same. And so I think it's not to denigrate online church, it's not to denigrate everything that's gone on and the efforts that people have gone, but I think we're too quick to look to the successes and not willing, myself included, not willing to look at those things where we actually need to sit with the damaging stuff and think, well, what went wrong? How do I deal with this? What do I feel about God?
Yes.
What do I feel about that?
Lloyd, what do you think about, there's glimmers, especially in chapter 4, of taking some glee in the punishment of others? I mean, and there's been a bit of that around in this current pandemic. You see towards the end of chapter 4 that over Edom, that the punishment that will perform.
The speaker there is going back again to that old covenant, isn't it? Oh God, do for us like you did in the old days. Smite our enemies with your right arm, not us. You've done enough on us. Turn your attention somewhere else. And he says at some point, daughter Edom, you're up for it next. How ugly is that? That's really ugly. I sense it at the moment in the kind of media reports we're getting of the vaccination crisis in Europe. It's almost like a bit of schadenfreude going on, isn't there? Well, I'm really pleased, actually. It's not working out for them. What an ugly way to approach this, where the rhetoric has always been, we're all in this together, we have to help out. When the chips are down, of course, just as in Lamentations, no, that's not the case at all. It's one-upmanship that keeps us going as well. Yeah, I'm finding that reflection a very ugly one to deal with at the moment. I'm also thinking as well about this idea of, if we don't start recognizing our grief now, we will be carrying it elsewhere for a long, long time. And we do have a blueprint in Lamentations for how to mourn properly, how to really get down there deep into our hearts and souls and mourn properly. What I find interesting is that when you look at how societies have gone through trauma in the past. So let's take, for instance, the loss of the Jerusalem temple, the destruction of that whole city, the planes flying into the Twin Towers in 2001. These are quite literally scars on the landscape, right? So you can go to them as places of pilgrimage. Still in Jerusalem, you weep at the remains of the second temple. In New York, you can go there and you can now, with these beacons of light, replace what was there, but there's a memorial garden. All of this is part of the healing process. It's not going to be the same when we come out of this. You cannot memorialize a plague. Okay, so there's talk of national forests and all that. Marvelous, nice, do it by all means. But everybody's going to be carrying their own grief, individual grief, which is, it's bespoke to them. And that reminds me really of this idea of the templelessness. And it kind of makes me think, okay, what's harder? To see the scar on the landscape and grieve through it, or to have a nothingness, just a concept, plague has gone, but here we are traumatized. How do we deal with that? That's I think where the church is going to have to work very hard to deal with that, because we cannot, it's not just about lighting a candle, is it? There's going to be deep, deep scars.
Well, it's not coincidental that one of the great existential novels was called The Plague. And that's the nature of pandemics, that there's nothing tangible, but it does, I mean, there seems to be, with everyone at the moment, along with grief, just a reminder of one's mortality and the existential dilemmas that we have in our existence. And so, I mean, Lloyd, we had a brief talk about R.S. Thomas's poem, Witch, and R.S. is very good at tackling some of this dynamic, this dialectic between faith, despair, and the nature of existence. The only thing I would say in that poem, for the listeners who want to go and look at it, there's a lot of question marks. And in the words seem despairing, but it's the actual question marks, which once again gives too much hope for my liking. There's a poem by a Polish poet, Herbert, and it's an elegy. And right at the end, in the last stanza, he talks about the oak leaves in the forest, that under every oak leaf there is utter despair. And I suppose that's what I'm saying is the church needs to capture the weight of this existential moment. And to do so, we can't, like the writer, the strong man does in this book, is resort to old tactics. We have to allow ourselves time.
Absolutely.
To hold the weight, to gather the weight, to move with the weight of the people.
Well, let's look at the last two verses then of the final chapter, okay? So let me read them to you, and then I'd love to hear your comments. So it starts kind of upbeat, okay? Whoever the speaker is, restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return, renew our days as of old. Perfect, okay? We've got lots of hope there. It's all, you will do it, Lord. And then this devastating, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. And there's no resolution. It just hangs there. It's almost like a realization, unless it's too late. What do we do with that? I mean, that is so problematic, isn't it? It's so difficult for us to deal with.
Although there is an element of supplication, which you don't necessarily get in the previous verses of that. I mean, chapter 5 intrigues me the most because there's a complete change of rhythm. And in the previous verses, there's just this sense of, well, he's sort of given up. He's just listing, well, there's been this, there's been this, there's been this. And then you get a flurry of hope in the last verses with a cliffhanger.
Yeah, cliffhanger's nice way of doing it, yeah.
But it's still the position of the supplicant. The writer of the previous verses, in that position of despair and anger, would he actually be coming to God, say, in that sort of servant-like way? Or would we say, actually, I've got no time for you now? But what the position should be, asking God, where are you? Where is your declaration of despair? Where is your cry for forgiveness? Now, obviously, we're not going to get that in the Jewish canon, but that is maybe what is required now, is a question mark to God himself.
Mm-hmm. Here we have a theology which is confusing its followers, and it's frightening them as well. A frightening and confusing theology, Rose. Identify with that at all at the moment?
I do, and I think my interest in Lamentations, so much also I have a huge interest in what it meant for the people on the ground at the time, who this is being written about.
The lowest of the low, right?
The lowest of the low. But I also have this draw to Lamentations as a liturgical action. That this sense of this cliffhanger, as Vincent calls it, this, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure, there's almost a pause. because there's a process in Lamentations of theological reflection that basically just boils down to complaint, lament, transformation. And that liturgical action is that the end isn't actually the end. And to use a phrase that a dear friend used to use, is it'll all be all right in the end. And if it's not the end, if it's not all right, it's not the end. And there's that sense of that when you think about that, the liturgical use of Lamentations, that they would have been an action of to go back to the beginning and to keep reading. And
as we do with the psalm cycles, that's the way.
So you would have been coming back to it, and actually where what somebody would be expected to finish isn't the end of chapter 5. I don't think personally, I may be wrong on this, but my personal feeling is that it would be to stop at either the Lord will not reject forever, or the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, greater his mercies every day. The slap bang in the middle of Lamentations 3. And that sense of is that this sort of lament that goes on in Lamentations is very much our situation. We've got this situation, the complaint, this is awful, everything that's happened to us is dreadful. Then the lament, the calling out to God, and actually calling out of God, which is important. There is the suggestion that the language of Lamentations is that when we hear things like when the person, the narrator, is calling out to God, it is a sense of literally calling out of God rather than calling out to God. Just like a mother would say to a toddler, well, my little James would never do that, as the child is doing it in front of them to make them feel some sort of shame at what they're doing. It's almost this action with the person who's watching, talking out to God, this calling out to God. Well, my God, the God of who loves me, the God of our old covenant, the God who has always protected us, would never treat us like this. And then you keep going, but of course it's you've got this complaint and lament, and eventually the idea is that you're reading through it and constantly reflecting on it, and eventually the reader will come, even if the people in the book itself haven't come to that transformation. As a result of this reflective process, the reader themselves will come to a moment of transformation where they can then feel the presence of God and their faith and that. So I find it, it intrigues me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think as a liturgical tool to be able to do that is really nice and kind of satisfying. And I really get where you're coming from. However, it kind of pulls for me against what is actually there on the page, in the Hebrew, in the translation that we got as well, where there is no resolution. And for me, if there's a cycle that's there at all, it's the cycle of abuse that continues, the abusive God, And if you just think about what God does to individuals, okay, in chapter 2, verse 2, swallows us up, torn down, cut off, burned, consumes, strung his bow, slain, wrath, smite. I mean, these are hardly passives, that is, and it's almost as though halfway through this, they say, but I love him, I love him. Oof. That's hard, isn't it? That's hard. These people are being caught in something which they need to move on from, and they're unable to move on from it. I think that's where we are in this plague year as well, in a way. We are caught in something, we need to get on from it and heal ourselves properly, but slowly and carefully and with help as well.
And maybe we can broaden the church's lament out further than just this pandemic, the whole issues which have affected the recent history of the church. Which, yes, there's been a lament offered for actions taken. But too often again, we want a quick positive resolve rather than sitting with the guilt. That's, I think, why Lamentations does, even though it's problematic, does resonate with now. Unlike, say, Isaiah or Malachi, where you have these somber endings, they're not as tricky as the ending we have here. And it's the tricky resolve which the church faces. We can respond to the criticisms of the church of actions taken, but no one really wants them. Those who've been abused by the church don't want that quick apology. They want to see despair and lament at a deep level. The Carl Rogers thing, but a dialectical encounter in counselling. There has to be a space. Stop jumping into that space with a ready response. Allow that space to grow. And it's in that space that another voice will be heard. And maybe we're not ready to hear that other voice. Because it seems that the author at the end here is crying out for a voice. But he's not able to hear because he's still trapped in the old language.
That's right. You could almost finish that last verse with a question mark, couldn't you?
Yes.
That's what it really needs. Actually, I think you're right. Isn't it fascinating? If you think back to the medieval church, or even to the early Reformed church as well, the space that the church gave for proper lament. I mean, some of the most magnificent choral pieces ever written are on Lamentations, for instance. We had that space, we had that sound world in which we could properly grieve, and not just grieve for ourselves, but grieve for our communities that faced death a lot more often than we do. Plague was a constant. Every few years, some village, town, or county would be faced with this, and the church responded in that way. There was a mechanism, as you say, Rose. A liturgy was already there for that. Could be accessed straight away. We've forgotten it, haven't we? It seems.
And I think something the church needs to bear in mind. There's a wonderful. There is the beginnings. There has been for the last few years the beginnings of looking at trauma theory with Old Testament, and it's fascinating. And
it is. It's very profitable too, I think.
And Kathleen O'Connor suggests that there's several responses to trauma that is evident in Old Testament scripture, and one of those, the fourth one, the final one, where if you get to the point of no return, you lose your faith. So you have your theodic crisis. You lose your faith in institutions, religions, and or God. That's what happens. And I think not just the church, but institutions in general, the government, everybody uses the language of lament in a very they just throw it out like sweets. This was lamentable. We feel great lament. We feel great regret that this happened. And there's always synonyms for the word for lament and that. But actually, what people need to see is to actually hear a heartfelt sorry. So for example, remembering a year or two ago when that not pastoral letter was sent out around the Lambeth conference, and there was a great hoo-ha among LGBT, especially LGBT clergy, myself included, because we were told that it was lamentable that people had responded in this way, but it really was a pastoral letter. Because yes, it was definitely a pastoral letter. It taught the teachings of the church, so it was pastoral in that sense of the word, but it wasn't pastoral in the sense of what the world around the church, outside that bubble of ecclesiology, outside of that, who would look at pastoral and go, well, actually, pastoral is about nurture, it's about home truths, it's about comfort, it's about looking after self-care and looking after people and counselling things, So I suppose my feeling is that quite often we're very quick to say, oh, that was lamentable, without actually thinking about the process of, if we truly believe that's lamentable, then there had to have been a process that has gone through to say, actually, there's a sense of shame for that happening, or there's a sense of, I need to change this, or I need to sit, and if I can't change it, I need to find a way to reconcile that with the people who it's affected the most, and actually listen to them as well.
As we draw this to a close, we're at the time. Let's ask one final question. And since we're kind of ending on this bleak note with almost a question mark, if there were to be found chapter 6 of Lamentations, okay? What would you like it to say?
For me, I would like the author to have grown a bit, to have travelled forward, recognising the inadequacy of his language, recognising the bravery of his vocalisation, his depth of despair, but that the moving into a new age has required a lot of him to develop a new vocabulary to speak of God. We've talked about the trauma of a pandemic, but we've had 50, 60 years of postmodernity. There's the trauma of the change of ages, and with each age we have a different view. We have a Victorian God, an Edwardian God, etc., etc. And our present vocabulary to deal with the trauma of changing from the postmodern age to what is to come is we're still relying in the church in the language of the liberal Christian or the evangelical Christian. Both vocabularies are hopeless for the new age. They both belong to the modern period, and they are struggling to cope with the changes which are necessary. So that's what excites me for the future of the church, is are we going to embrace this new age and develop a new vision of God? And that's what I would hope for the author of Lamentations. There was a realization that all that had gone before was of no use, and something fresh was desired and needed.
That's interesting. Rose,
I think I'm
chapter 6.
I think I'm quite like Vincent. Is I'd like to see a sense of coming out of the ashes. This new transformed realization about God and what God means. But also, I think I'm a bit of a fluffy optimist on the side. I'd love to sort of have a moment where in chapter 6 that the person comes to the transformation and goes, yes, God is there, God is there, God is there, God is there, is with me. That line that we give to people, isn't it, when things go wrong, is God never promised that nothing bad would happen. God just promises that you won't be alone in it. And so for me, as I want to be a realization of that. I want the person to be able to feel that God is there and God is with them amongst all this crud that's going on. And I know that makes me a very, very fluffy optimist, but
it doesn't at all. It doesn't. For me, I think it would be the shortest book of the Bible, and it would read, and God said, wait. And of course, in Hebrew, wait is exactly the same word as trust. Okay, if you wait for God, you trust in God. If you trust in God, then you need to wait for God. His ways are not our ways, right? And for me, I mean, it has to be, and this is no good for the people of Jerusalem in the 6th century who are suffering this thing. But, for me as a Christian, it has to be about waiting for the cross and to be on the other side of the cross. And I do reflect on the idea that, in many ways, Lamentations is and re-echoed after the cross as well. And I find it fascinating that really our faith, Christian faith, is founded on trauma as well. The trauma of Christ's body itself, the agony, the suffering of that, the trauma that went around it for those who followed him. And even when the Gospels are written, the next national trauma that goes on, the destruction of the next temple, this time by the Romans as well. So, it's really interesting. For a book that is so often overlooked, Lamentations could offer Christians a lot in the way they think about the conception of their faith, and even the construction of its sacred texts has, I think, resonances with Lamentations. For a small book, it has a lot to say.
The one thing I would add there is this trauma you speak of happens within the Godhead too. Holy Saturday is not just a human trauma. God is traumatized by the events of Easter, and so therefore we require a new doctrine of God post-event.
But isn't it amazing that God becomes incarnate so that he can suffer what these people suffer, to really know, this idea of the omnipotent and omniscient God. Yeah. I often struggle with that, because how do you, if you're an unembodied force, okay, a great cosmic entity, how do you know how do you know what pain is? A physical pain of something being hurt or cut. And I think I've always thought, if you look at the Gospel of Mark in particular, the first of our Gospels, the shortest, and in many ways the most brutal of the Gospels, Jesus, as God, is on a learning curve all the time. He feels things, he's experiencing things. And Mark's Gospel account of the crucifixion is the shortest and the hardest. There's no fluff there, is there? There is no talking to the robbers on either side of you. It is simply, God, why have you abandoned me? Which brings us perfectly back round in that cyclic way to Lamentations as well, isn't it? That ending of chapter 5 is almost spoken again on the cross.
So maybe our conversation doesn't end here, but carries on past Easter to Ascension. Because I would argue, how does this omniscient God, which you speak of, experience these human emotions, interactions? But Ascension changes the game. Humanity is taken into the Godhead at that point, and God is different from that point.
God changes. That's a good place to stop. We will stop there. Thank you all, friends. And for those of you who are watching and listening, thank you so much for joining us. So please go to the website. Below you'll see there's a link for Friday, on Good Friday at 6 o'clock. We will be meeting again. Please come and join us via that link and discuss the thoughts that you might have on Lamentations. You'll see that online we've already uploaded recordings of Lamentations in English and Welsh, also in Hebrew if you're keen, and also other bits and pieces which might be of help to you too. But please come and join us 6 o'clock on Good Friday. So from me, it's goodbye.
From me, goodbye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.